In this video, we're going to extend our Django and HTMX application, and we're going to add the Django import-export package to the project. Now this package, as it says here, it's a Django application for importing and exporting data with full admin integration. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to go to our application and look at the transactions that we have. And to this page here where we have a list of transactions, we're going to add an icon and allow users to export the list of transactions. And in the next video, we're going to allow users to actually import transactions from a CSV file into the database so that they can be viewed in the application. So we're going to use Django import-export to achieve that functionality. And that's common functionality in an application. If you have, for example, transaction data in a bank, you might want to export that to a CSV or an Excel file and then analyze that or do something with that file. Very common practice. So we're going to implement that in this particular video. And if you're interested in how this package Django import-export works with the Django Unfold admin theme, you can check out the recent video we did on that, which should be appearing on the screen now. Now, before we start, if you're not already subscribed, it would be greatly appreciated if you would subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content. And if you want to support the channel, we have a coffee page here for bug bites that's linked in the description. So thank you to everyone who has supported the channel through this coffee page. What we're going to do now is we're going to open up VS Code, and I'm going to stop the Django development server for this. And what we're going to do is run pip install django-import-export. Now there's a link to the documentation for Django import-export in the description, and you can copy that pip install command from there. Once it's installed, we can clear the terminal. We're going to minimize that, and we're going to get started with adding that to our project. Let's head over to the documentation for Django import-export. What we're going to do is go to the Getting Started page here, and we can look at this page to see what's going on with Django import-export. So imagine you have a set of models in the application, and we already do have that in our transaction application. And what you do in Django import-export is you create what's called a resource class. And a resource can be tied to a model, for example here, by using the model resource subclass. Now this works very similarly to the way you would work with a serializer or a form class. We have a meta inner class, and we link the particular resource to the model. And we're going to start here by adding a model resource to our application. So let's go to VS Code, and I'm going to open up the tracker Django application, and let's create a file here called resources.py. This is a file where we're going to store all of the resources that are tied to our model in the application. Now in this file, I'm going to bring in a couple of imports at the top. So from Django import-export, we're going to import resources and fields, and we're also going to import two models that we've defined in this series. That's transaction and category. Now before we go on, let's go over to settings.py. One thing I didn't do is add import-export to installed apps. So we're going to add that to the external apps section here, import_export. And once we've added that, we can actually use Django import-export in this project. Let's go back to the documentation. I'm just going to copy this, and we're going to define a resource class in resources.py. So let's paste that in here. Now we don't have a book model in this application. What we are going to define instead is a transaction resource, and the model that that's going to be attached to is going to be transaction. So we can remove the comment. We're tying the resource, because it's a model resource, to one of the models that we have in the application. And as well as the model, we can add a property to the meta class called fields. And again, very similar to a form or a Django REST Framework serializer. And this is going to link us to some of the fields that we have in the transaction model class here. So I'm going to add the fields for the following values: the amount for the transaction, as well as the date, the category, and what's the other one? It's the type. So the type is going to be income or expense. Let's go back to resources.py, and I'm going to paste in these fields here. So by adding these fields, it's going to tell the Django import-export package what fields are going to be handled during import. So we have a page here on declaring explicitly the import fields. So when we use the fields declaration, this affects which fields are handled during import. Now we don't need to, for example, attach things like the primary key for the transaction when we import transactions into the database. We also don't need to define the user in the incoming data. If a user is uploading a file containing transactions, we want that user to be automatically tied to the transactions, so we don't need that field to be part of the resource. And similarly, we don't need the primary key because that's automatically assigned by the database. So that's why we've limited the resource fields to a subset of what's on the model. So that makes sense during the import. Now we also need to handle the foreign key between the transaction and the category, because on the transaction model, we have a foreign key to whatever category it's associated with. So when we import data from a file, we need to perform a lookup when we're importing that data to get the correct category. Now let's say in the category model here we have the name field, and that's the field that's going to be present in the CSV file. So if we upload a CSV of transactions here, what we're going to have in the category column is the name of the category. So it's not going to be the primary key of the category, and obviously it's not going to be an actual object as well. So we need to take that name and perform a lookup to the database table for category. Now in order to make that association when we import the data, I'm going to reference this section of the documentation. So if we are importing data for a model instance that has a foreign key relationship to another model, then import-export can handle the lookup and linking to the related model. So what we can define here is a field in our resource, and that's going to be by calling the field constructor here, and we're going to pass a widget called the foreign key widget. So what I'm going to do here at the top is from import-export.widgets, let's import the foreign key widget into the resource module. And when we have that, we can go back to our resource class, and we're going to explicitly define the category field here by instantiating that field object. And we need to pass some arguments to that. So the column name, we're going to set that to category. So let's go back to the resource class. So the column name is going to be equal to category. And what this is going to do is basically when we export our transactions to a file, it's going to have a column name of category for this particular field. We can change that to anything we want, but I want the column to have the name category. And what we also pass here, if we go back to the documentation, is an attribute. So let's paste attribute in here. And this is the instance attribute on the transaction model. So the transaction has a foreign key and the attribute is called category. So we're also going to use the string category here. And finally, we're going to pass a widget in here. If we go back to the documentation and look at this here, we've got a foreign key widget. I'm going to copy this and let's paste it in here. And we're going to change the model, of course, to the category model. That's the foreign key from the transaction. And actually the field can remain the same because the field on the category that we're linking this to is the name field. So when we're uploading transactions, the column is going to have the category names, and we want to do that lookup based on the name field on the category model. Now we'll come back to this soon, but we're also going to define a button now that's going to allow users to export the list of transactions. So that's just going to be a mechanism for the user to actually click a button and then get an exported list of transactions. I'm going to go to hero icons here, and what I'm going to search for here is, let's search for a download icon, because ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to download or export the transactions. And I'm going to copy one of these, and let's just use this one here, arrow down tray. Let's copy the SVG element and go back to VS Code. And what I'm going to go to is the transaction container page. So transaction container.html. And let me start the server here so we are going to see where we are in this application. So the container, if we go back to the transaction list, this is this page here. It contains these transactions, and at the right hand side here we have a button that allows us to add a transaction. What I want to do is add another icon next to that button that's going to allow us to download the transactions using this icon that we've copied here. So let's go back to the container, and we're going to find the add transaction button. So we have this anchor tag here, and that uses the hxget attribute to load the create transaction page. So this here is the SVG element for adding a transaction. What I want to do is add another icon here, and I'm going to add this, but I'm going to put it inside a container, and I'm also going to put the existing anchor tag in a container. So let's surround this with a div, and we're going to give it a class of flex. And as well as flex, I want to center these items on the cross axis. So we're going to add the item center class from Flexbox, and let's tab that existing anchor tag over to the right and close off the div below. So we're going to keep the create transaction link at the top right, and then we have this Flexbox, so we're going to push to the right hand side of that by default another anchor tag. So what I'm going to do here is, let me just make sure the indentation is correct. I'm going to copy this anchor tag and let's paste that below here. And we're going to change the URL that we're going to reference here in a second. In fact, for now, let's completely remove the HTMX attributes because we don't have any URLs at the moment. And let's go back to hero icons. And again, we're copying this SVG, and I'm going to replace what's here by default. So let's paste that in, and I'm going to clean this up. And let's just summarize what we have here. We have a div now surrounding the icons at the top right, and they are in a Flexbox. So each icon is going to align up left to right at the top right hand side here. So we first of all have the create transaction icon, and now below that we have another anchor tag that contains this SVG here for downloading or exporting the transactions. Let's save this and go back to our page. And when we refresh this page, you can see we now have this download link here. Now I'm going to change the styles a little bit here. Let's go back to the page. What I'm going to do is go to the SVG that we've added from Hero Icons. Currently it's got a class of size 6. I'm going to add a few different styles here. So let's add a width of 10 actually, and a height of 10. So we're going to make this bigger. And let's also add some margin left of 2 here to separate it a bit from the other icon. And finally, cursor pointer, so that when we hover over this icon, we are aware that it's clickable because we're going to show the cursor, or rather we're going to change the cursor to a pointer. Let's save this and go back to the page, refresh the page, and now we have this larger icon now, let's say, for exporting the transactions, and we have the pointer when we hover over that. Now, at the moment, if we click this, nothing is happening. We have an anchor tag, but it's not doing anything. It doesn't have any href, and it doesn't have any HTMX attributes. We're going to do this export using HTMX, and we want to send the request to a Django view that's then going to download the file of transactions. And as well as that, when this export button is clicked, so that the backend knows which transactions to export, we also want to send any parameters or any values that have been defined in this form here by the user. So how do we do that? Let's go back to our page here, and we're going to find this anchor tag. And when this is clicked, we're going to send a GET request, and let's use the URL template tag from Django. And I'm going to define a URL in a second called export. And to include all of the values in the form, we can use the hx-include attribute. And that's another HTMX attribute that allows you to include additional parameters in the request. And what we're going to add here is the filter form values. So if we pass the ID of the filter form, that's going to add all of the values from that form to the request. Now the filter form, if we scroll down, it's this one here. It's got an ID of filter form, and that maps to what you see on the right hand side. So when we actually export these transactions, we're going to include, for example, if we select a type here, we're going to include that in the request so that the backend can take that, and the Django filter set can do the appropriate filtering in order to get the correct set of transactions to export. So this is going to all work with the filter form, and it's going to allow the user, for example, to export transactions between 2 dates. Now at this stage, we can go back to VS Code, and if we go back up to where we defined this new icon here, we have a new URL called export. So what I'm going to do is open up the urls.py file for the application, and at the bottom here, let's add a new URL. So we'll paste this path in here, transaction/export. That's going to call a view called export that we need to define now. So let's go to views.py, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom here and define this function-based view that takes the request as an argument. And again, what we want to do to start with, if we go up to this charting view that we created in the last video, is we want to get the transaction filter and use that to filter down the transactions based on what's sent in the GET request. So when this happens here in the container, we are including all the parameters from the form, so they'll be sent in the GET request, and Django can then extract those from the GET request, pass them to the filter in order to filter down this base query set. So that's going to give us back a filter that has a query set of objects. What we need to do now is we need to use the resource that we defined here in resources.py. So I'm going to import the transaction resource, and I'm going to do that at the top of the file. So let's go up, and from tracker.resources, we're going to import that class. And I also want to import another object here from django.http. Let's import the HTTP resource. And these imports are a bit unwieldy at the moment. You can use a tool like iSort if you want to sort them automatically. I'm not going to do that in this video. Let's go back down here, and what we're going to do after we've filtered down and got our query set of transactions is we're going to define a variable called data, and we're going to instantiate that resource class that we've imported. So it's the transaction resource, and that has a function called export. Now, as you can see in VS Code here, what that takes as a parameter is a query set, and that's the query set of the objects that are tied to the resource that you can then export. So what we're going to pass in here is the transaction filter.qs property. That gives us the filtered query set of transactions based on the line of code above and the get parameters from the request. Once we have that in our variable called data, what we can do is we can create a response by returning the HTTP response class, and we're going to pass data.csv into that and just return this response. Now notice that the data has this CSV property, or at least we're accessing that just now. And that's because under the hood, django-import-export is using this object called dataset, and that has different properties for different formats that you want to export your data to. Now we're going to test this just now, and it's not going to work, but we're going to move on after that and figure out what's going on. So when we click this, you can see we get back this very strange user interface. So it looks like we've got some kind of CSV data here, but we probably don't want to just dump that CSV data into this section of the page. What we might want to do instead is actually download that to a file, but that's not actually so easy to do when you're using an AJAX request, which HTMX itself is performing under the hood. So what I'm going to do now is what can only be described as a quick hack. If the request is an HTMX request, we're actually going to redirect the request to the same view with a normal non-AJAX request. So let's see how that works now. If we go back to views.py, and by the way, we should probably be protecting this route with the login required decorator. And once we've done that, we can check if the request is an HTMX based request. And if that's true, what we can do is return another HTTP response. And we're going to pass some headers into the response here. And I'm going to pass hx redirect. And we're going to set that to request.getFullPath. And that gives us back the full path for the request. And you could probably have guessed that based on the name of the function. So basically, if the request comes from HTMX, we're immediately going to return an HTTP response. And we're going to add this custom hx redirect header. And that's going to do a client-side redirect to a new location, but it's actually going to perform a redirect to the exact same URL. But this time, after that redirect occurs, it's not going to be an AJAX request. It's going to be a normal HTTP request, and then this block of code will not run in the subsequent request, and this data or this logic here will be processed, and hopefully we're going to see that we can now download a file. So let's go back to the page. I'm going to refresh the page here, and when we click this button, you can see we now have the data appearing on the page. Now, if you have a better solution to this, please let me know. This is a bit of a hack in my opinion, but AJAX requests, when you send them, it's not easy to immediately download files of data as far as I know. But if you know anything, let me know in the comments about that. Now we want to actually download the file to our local file system. We don't want it to just be displayed on the browser like this. So what we can do is we can add another header to the response. So I'm going to go down here to where the response is generated. And we're going to add a header here to the response called content-disposition. And we're going to set that to the following value. So we're going to say it's an attachment, and we can give it a file name here, and let's call it transactions.csv. So what is the content disposition header? If we go to the Mozilla documentation, so in a regular HTTP response, this response header is a header that indicates if the content is expected to be displayed in line on the browser or as part of an attachment. And an attachment will be downloaded and saved locally. What we are telling the browser here is that we are sending an attachment and we want to download a file name called transactions.csv. Let's now save this and go back to our application here, and let's go back to the transactions page. And this time when we click download, you can see at the top right, we are downloading that data to a transactions.csv file, and we can open that file in Excel. And you can see here the transactions for this user have now been downloaded. We have the 4 columns that we specified in our resource class. And that data is then available, and we can then forward that data if we need to data analysts or data engineers or anyone in our organization. So that can be very useful for very quickly in your web applications getting data out of the database and into formats that can be sent to other people. Now let's check if this is going to work with the filters that we have on the front end. So we have this Django filter set. If we go back to the page now, and this time let's select expenses only, we can filter down the table here, and you can see we've only got expenses now. And this time we can click download and we get another CSV file. When I open that, you can see after that's been opened here that we only have expenses in this table. So the filters are all working fine on our application. We can filter based on dates, based on the type of transaction, and based on the categories that we're interested in. And then we can click this export button, and that's going to download that to a CSV file. And notice as well in the downloaded file that the category column contains the actual name of the category. So it's not referencing a primary key here or an ID, it's referencing the name of the category. If we go back to the resource class that we've defined from django-import-export, if we actually comment out the category field here and go back to our web application, this time when we click download, we're going to download another CSV file, and I'm going to open that now. And you can see this time that the categories contain the primary key IDs by default. So if you want to show anything else, you can define a foreign key widget for that particular field and specify what the field you want to show is actually going to be in the data. So let's uncomment that again, and let's now move on. We're going to show how to work with different formats, not just CSV data. If we go back to views.py, when we called the transaction resource, we called the export function and passed a query set in, and then that gave us back a dataset object which had this .csv attribute. Now we can actually get different formats here, so what I'm going to do is show a couple of those just to finish the video. So let's imagine we wanted this data in JSON format. Well, the dataset also has a .json property, and we can also change the name of the file name, or rather the extension for the file name that's going to be downloaded, to transactions.json. So let's save that and we'll go back to the page again. I'm going to refresh this page, and this time when we click download, at the top right you can see we've got a transactions.json file, and when I open that, I'm going to bring it onto the screen here. You can see now we have JSON data for that particular resource in our application. And one last one just to finish the video here. Let's imagine that we have a database of data, and for some reason we want to export that to YAML format. So we can use that as well, and I'm going to change the extension as before. And let's go back to the page, and we're going to click the export button here. And I'm actually getting an error here, and that's that the dataset object has no attribute YAML. Now the reason for this actually is because under the hood, the Django import-export package is using this package called tablib. And this allows you to import, export and manipulate tabular datasets. And what we did was we installed Django import-export, but if we go to the installation section for tablib, you can see there are ways to install additional dependencies. For example, if you want to install all supported dependencies, you can run this command here, and that's going to also add support for Excel spreadsheets, YAML, pandas formats, and so on. So I'm going to run this command here and go back to VS Code. So let's paste that into the terminal, and we're going to install that. And then I'm going to go back to the page. Let's restart the server first of all and go back to the page containing our error here. And I'm going to refresh this page, and we're going to see at the top right now we can download the YAML file. So now we can download CSV, JSON and YAML files. We're back on the list page now. So what we've done in this video is we've added this icon that allows us to export our data from the database to files of different formats, and we can do that using our filters on the right hand side as well. And this has all been done by defining what's called a resource class using Django import-export, and that allows us to flexibly tie a resource to a model and determine what fields are used during import and what fields you want to export from your model. So we're doing all of that in this video. In the next video, we're going to add import functionality to the page. So imagine you have a list of transactions in a CSV file and you want to upload those in bulk to the database. You don't want to have to go through one at a time and click this button to be taken to this form. So instead of doing that one at a time, we might want to have some import functionality in the application. We're going to add that in the next video, and that's actually the last video I've got planned for this series. But if you have any further ideas for this application, let me know in the comments, and we can maybe try and add some new features after that next video. But thanks again for watching. If you've enjoyed the content, give it a thumbs up. If you're enjoying this content in general and you want to support the channel, check the Ko-fi link in the description, and we'll see you in the next video.